Welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. My name is Michael LeBlanc, and I am your host. This podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada.
Meet Alyssa Rade, Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain Life, a leading carbon accounting platform where she leads the company's strategy for product content, guiding retailers across North America and the world on their decarbonization and ESG journeys. Alyssa unpacks the complexities of carbon accounting for all of us, providing a uniform model for retailers, brands, and vendors in tracking, reporting, and understanding their decarbonization work. Let's listen in now.
Alyssa, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I am fantastic. Where am I finding you today?
You find me today in Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah, now, we're getting a bit of snow for the first time this year in Toronto. Are you getting any snow? You guys had some snow, right? Like this week, you had some weather?
We did. New York City actually didn't get too much, but I was actually in northern New Jersey, and we got like a solid 10 inches. It was school snow days, snowman building, sledding, the real winter dream.
I was going to say that's a lot for you guys. So, it sounds like you survived okay. You and I met, speaking of New York, I was in New York for the big NRF show, and we were at a dinner with a bunch of fellow retail types from Australia, and you and I got to talk, and it was just great. And I thought, hey, let's get on the mic and share some of your insights. So thanks for taking the time to join me on the podcast.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. I feel like I was so lucky I got to sit next to you at that dinner, and I really enjoyed myself and happy to continue the conversation here.
Well, let's jump right in. Tell the people a little bit about your background and what you do for a living.
Sure. So I'm Alyssa Rade, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain Life. We're a decarbonization SaaS platform specifically focused on supply chain decarbonization. As CSO, my role, I have the privilege of leading our company's sustainability team. And so that's really the domain experts that are responsible for conceptualizing all of the innovative tools and strategies within our SaaS platform to advance decarbonization. So that's things like carbon accounting, setting science-based targets, decarbonization plans, ESG reporting, kind of the whole gamut of everything you need around climate, carbon, and sustainability.
You know, I do a lot of interviews in this space. Actually, I just did an interview we just published on Remarkable Retail, my other podcast with Steve, who you also met. We interviewed the SVP of Sustainability from Walmart. And, you know, my observation was in interviewing people, they kind of fall into three buckets, so to speak. There's a group of people who are strategists and get into the sustainability file in one way, shape, or another because they just find it just a fascinating, all-encompassing, touches every element of the business. There's another group of people who are kind of operators who love the challenge, the multifaceted challenge of, again, a business that touches everything. And then there's a third group of people who grew up in the sustainability world. They're practitioners. They may have a science background. Which one do you fall in?
Yes, I'm in your third category. So I'm truly a pretty historic pure play sustainability. I quite literally went into college in environmental sciences, declared major, and did not really waver and pursued graduate degrees and have had roles throughout the field, both on the consulting and in-house side throughout my full career.
Did you always want to be in the sustainability field? Like at what point when you were, going in high school or maybe even elementary school? Who knows? Maybe in the crib, you were like, I'm going to help the world. But where did it start for you?
Yeah. I just always, my logic was if I was going to spend so much of my time working, which I knew I always was, quite professionally minded. I wanted it to be for something that really mattered, that I really cared about, that I really wanted to see change and progress in. And so it was a pretty clear path for me, honestly.
Where'd you get that from? Like your parents, your peers? Like what was that spark that you wanted both the accountability and some of us are born with more work ethic than others. So, but how did you get pointed in that direction?
It's a great question. I really love you're digging into my childhood roots. I spent a lot of time with my father who was in his youth, commune living, outdoorsman, botany graduate degree. And so there was just a huge appreciation for nature and being outside in my childhood. Probably my fondest memories, in the garden, hiking, bird watching. And so I just think it was very much woven into my sense and perspective of how to most appreciate the world.
Nice. Let's talk about Sustain Life. So you're the I don't know if I call it the sign space, but I also know you have other counterparts, your fellow C-level executives. They come from a retail and a technology background. So you've talked about decarbonization, and for those of us not steeped in the language of sustainability, tell us a little bit about what exactly you do in helping retailers in the retail context, and then or start with your other counterparts in the organization and who they are and why they came to this and what skills they bring.
Yeah. So let me start with the founding story of Sustain Life, because I do think it's one that will really resonate with your retail listening base. So we're actually founded by one of the co-founders of Jet.com.
Okay.
For those who don't know, e-commerce platform that was acquired by Walmart in a very large e-commerce deal. Yep. And so our core team of product and software engineers has worked together for a very long time building enterprise grade software with that e-commerce, kind of focus. And when the founding team was when they, went into Walmart from the Jet acquisition, they were exposed to Project Gigaton, which is Walmart's kind of climate action plan to remove a gigaton of carbon from the atmosphere by 2030. And so during that time, they saw firsthand the resources that were really required to take climate action. And now Walmart, of course, has those resources. And so they have, Project Gigaton. And what they're asking throughout their supply chain is they're asking suppliers to furnish information to them. There's a lot of things that Walmart does within their own operations. They can, have energy efficient strategies in their stores. They can put solar on the rooftop. But a lot of Walmart, just like every corporate and every retailer's footprint, is really from their supply chain, right? The goods that they are selling and moving through those stores and the upstream and downstream impacts of those goods. And so what the founders saw is that suppliers were responding to Walmart's request for emissions and sustainability data, but they lacked the more holistic and integrated strategy of sustainability. And so they were losing out on some of the auxiliary benefits of sustainability beyond just the environmental performance, things like reduced operating costs, talent retention, lower cost of capital, et cetera.
And who is the they in that sentence? Is that Walmart or the vendors?
That was the vendors, their suppliers. So Walmart was getting all of those benefits because they have a dedicated sustainability team and practice. And this is, a very mature part of their business strategy. But their suppliers who, it's a pretty steep curve when you're a supplier and you're asked, by your most important customer, I need you to allocate your emissions to me of what I'm responsible for buying your goods and services. There's a whole lot in there to unpack around carbon accounting. And so the suppliers were really losing out on that more holistic perspective and strategy of, okay, how do we connect these numbers and data and outputs to something that's more meaningful to our actual business operation?
So would you say, as an organization, is retail a vertical for you? Do you operate in other verticals? Is retail a big vertical for you? Just give me a scope of the scope
absolutely.
Of the business.
We do. We like to kind of say we're industry agnostic, which we are. When you're carbon accounting, there's a whole system and hierarchy about how you do these things. And a lot of it is just a corporate standard. And so our SaaS platform, our tool, can handle any company and serve any company that, is a corporation that follows just standard carbon accounting practice, which is most industries, for the record.
Tell me a little bit more. Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that, because I know, of course, accounting has standardized practices that, is that the case in your industry? Like we count, does everybody count everything in the same way, or is that part of what you bring as a kind of harmonized structure to accounting of decarbonization? Yeah,
it's a great question. So the answer is a yes and a no. So there's a protocol called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and that's essentially the accounting guidebook. That's the standard guidebook for how you move through carbon accounting. And there's a couple different books and a couple different standards. And so you have to collate all of them. And what's important to know about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is how you do carbon accounting, is that it is a guideline, but it's not prescriptive. So there's essentially always a hierarchy of methodologies of how one might do things. So like a brief example, if you're trying to account for the emissions from vehicles, you can either do so by calculating the total fuel consumed in those vehicles and, emission factors for burning diesel or natural gas or, whatever kind of gas you're using. Or you could do it by the distance that you've traveled and mileage or kilometers, whatever your unit of measure. Or you could do it by the amount of money that you've spent on fuel. And those have different kind of outputs in terms of the precision of what those emissions represent. And the whole point with carbon accounting is that you're not always going to have, in fact, you will almost never have perfect data for what you're trying to account for. And so what we do is really help companies understand where they can use, where our platform can serve them with the best methodology, depending on what data you reasonably have access to.
Just to unpack that last part a little bit, as you describe the different ways to measure, when you think about, let's say I was reading a big grocer in Canada just got some big electric delivery trucks, which I'm a big fan of. I mean, you can really start to make impact in the supply chain. Now, when you account for that, do you account for the energy going into creating the energy itself? The electricity is not free. Something has to generate it. Now, where I am in Ontario, something like 60 to 80% is generated by nuclear, which is very clean. Is that factored in? Because there's, other places maybe more solar, wind, or water. I don't know, maybe even some coal. So how does that factor in backwards looking?
Yep. So in this example, you're talking about scope 2 emissions, which are emissions from any energy that you purchase. So you're purchasing electricity to charge your vehicles, right? And the way that you calculate the emissions is by an emission factor. So if you're consuming, we'll use an even number, 100 kilowatt hours of electricity, you multiply it by a certain factor that represents, well, what was that electricity made of? Was it made from renewable sources? Was it made from coal or fossil fuels? And those factors are in data sources and data sets. In Canada, the Canadian National Inventory actually breaks up the grid into the different regions of the country because grids have different emissions intensity behind them in terms of where they're sourcing their power. In the US, we have what's called eGrid, which is a bit more granular. And so each eGrid zone actually has a different emissions factor that reflects the composition of where that electricity or what sources that electricity was generated from.
Your solution starts to sound a bit to me like something a little more anodyne, which is kind of tax software. Like, that there's a million different types of sources of tax, but I'm going to find a solution that helps me pull it all into one place. Is that not a terrible way to think about it? Like I would suspect in your solution, you would be able to capture what you just described automatically and not have to go looking for it as a retailer. Yeah,
exactly. And absolutely. We often actually use analogies to financial accounting when you're talking about carbon accounting. So this is the same idea of, automating, we call it activity data in carbon accounting. So the activity data are those kilowatt hours of consumption, right? And understanding what you automatically should be applying to that activity data from, in this calculation with the emissions factors. And you're also absolutely spot on that is so much the power of a technology solution to do that, in that you don't want to do this manually. I mean, the way that companies have historically done that, because of course, large enterprises have been reporting on their emissions for decades, for especially the leaders in this space, is it was manual. They're in spreadsheets. You have to update your emissions factors. There's all different, it's not just one factor. Then there's 3 factors that go into that one factor. I mean, there's a lot of, upstream math involved.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot. Now, one of the things you and I were talking about back to New York is I was interested in what you're doing. And I said, I have this little pod in Canada. Do you have any business in Canada? So you do work on both sides of the border in North America. Do you do also global? Talk about that scope there. I think we skipped over that. I'm curious about your how far you engage your business in.
Yep. We're pretty global. I think we're on 5 continents. And plenty of business certainly in North America. I'll say, maybe it's helpful to do a couple of examples in the retail sector of kind of who we work with and what that looks like.
Yeah, that'd be great if you can.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with a couple of brand names that are perhaps recognizable to some of the listeners. So we do work with a lot of outdoor adventure apparel brands, which kind of makes sense, right? Their products are a little bit more directly connected with nature. You can't go skiing and wear winter coats if you don't have a lot of snow.
Yeah, it's true.
So we started working with Moose Knuckles some time ago, outdoor apparel brand, and then several brands across the U.S. as well. And a lot of these retailers are really looking to measure their emissions. Sometimes for the first time, other times they have done their first inventory and they've used that manual process, or perhaps they used a consultant, which they are quite expensive. And so they're looking to really own this process and this ability themselves. We're also seeing a fair amount of those companies wanting to report according to the voluntary frameworks. So things like GRI, of which we're also an accredited software provider. And I guess I'll mention specifically about voluntary frameworks is there's a lot of regulation going on in the climate disclosure space right now. Europe is an absolute leader with their CSRD reporting requirements, but we have, over here in the US, a proposed SEC rule. Well, that kind of delays it by the SEC. We've had California come out with state level legislation.
Of course.
And this legislation, it doesn't come out of thin air. All of this legislation is based on existing voluntary frameworks. And so I think what we're seeing is a lot of retailers preparing for that legislation by getting their ducks in a row and getting all of the data and kind of processes in place to report to these frameworks for now so that they are ready for the legislation when it comes.
Let's switch gears a little bit. So when I think of, my listeners, and of course, when you think about the retail environment across North America, there's the big, the Walmarts of the world with very sophisticated systems and resources and people, and they can dedicate people to sustainability and the climate action and all that. For the retailers that, maybe it falls on the desk of the CFO or it falls to someone else, when you have the conversations with them, how does that go? Do you have a common language? Do you spend some time, scope 1, scope 2? I mean, do you start at that kind of basics and work up? Talk about the conversations you have when you're talking to a client. I'm not sure Moose Knuckles would have a dedicated senior vice president of sustainability, for example.
Totally.
They may, but they may not, right? So how does that go?
Absolutely. And so we do really work with companies across the spectrum of both size and sophistication. And those things are not always, linearly related, but they often are. So a lot of times you see with the smaller companies, they are less mature. They're newer to this space, and they do need a fair bit of contextualization and knowledge building, as you said. And so we've built all of that into the platform, integrated in, so that as you're moving through the application, frankly, you are seeing scope 1 and 2, but you're also seeing buildings, vehicles, transportation and distribution, logistics. You're seeing the business language that you're familiar with, from your primary role. And in that capacity, we're often working at those type companies with procurement teams, supply chain managers, and more of those operational folks. Right.
Yeah, that's right. That, the people who are kind of charged to make this happen, and they got to think, I don't even know where to start. As I go through your site, it's really great because you perform that.
Thank you.
Let's shift gears again and step back and try to understand how. You've been doing this a long time, so this is a great opportunity to talk to you about get your perspective, kind of inside out. The consumers kind of, I don't know if I could say ebb and flow. Whether they're concerned, does it ebb and flow on the economy? Sometimes consumers say one thing and do another. They talk about sustainability, but they buy, fast fashion stuff straight from China that is really, it's fast to the landfill, right? It's direct to landfill, as I like to call it. So, it's not unusual for consumers to change their minds or, say one thing and do another. How are you feeling about the commitment? I talk to retailers who are like, listen, man, I'm finding it hard to compete on these sustainability measures because the consumers seem to care less than I thought they did. What's your experience?
Yeah, I think with this one, it's a yes and no. I think most retailers, especially your big box retailers, your bigger brands, they see the writing on the wall, right? They get it. They know the regulation is coming. They need to comply. Many of them have actually already been doing this. Frankly, and for the smaller ones as well, it doesn't mean that a rough performance quarter isn't going to push off the plan, right? This was a Q1 plan. We had a tough quarter. We're going to reevaluate. We're going to push this to Q2. But those kind of intermittent delays are not really delaying the longer term strategy and kind of conclusion that this is happening and this is a business imperative. We're seeing this especially if you look at the smaller retailers, it's coming in RFPs. They literally can't get the business of the big buyers. You can't get Walmart's business if you don't furnish them with this information. It is a requirement of doing business.
Interesting. You do frame it in the kind of regulatory perspective rather than a consumer perspective. How are you feeling about? Are you disappointed some days about consumers, your fellow, travelers, and how they think about this issue, or are you just, listen, they'll all come around? And do you lead with regulation, or do you lead with consumer intent and passion? How do you think about that?
Yeah, well, there's actually a third bucket or a stakeholder group that I would introduce here, which is investors in capital markets. And so I agree with you. I think consumers oftentimes vote with their wallet, right? They make purchasing decisions based on their wallet. But I do think that investors take a slightly different approach when they are assessing opportunities and, risks and opportunities for how they're going to be spending their capital dollars. And so I do think that that's worth noting there as well.
Okay, that's cool. Let's kind of start wrapping up with advice time. So, wide variety of retailers listening and brands, and give us some big picture advice. And let's frame it in the 2 starts and 1 stop. 2 things they should start doing. One thing that, maybe that you come into a client engagement and you say, hey, we're doing this and we're excited about it. You're like, that's not going to work so well, or that doesn't work in our experience. Give us some advice.
Yep. All right. The first start is period. Just start. Right? Don't be intimidated. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, because you're not expected to do this at 100% precision on day one. And that's why so many of these, sure, on the regulation side, they have phase-in periods, and different safe harbor clauses for what you're not, going to be legally penalized for. You're not expected to do it all perfectly on day one, but you are expected to do it. So get your house in order, start the process, because there is a lot to learn and to get comfortable. And there are, a fair amount of judgment calls to make. And so get started so that you feel comfortable making those judgment calls. My second start is utilize tools and technology. And this is not a shameless plug for Sustain Life. Choose your preferred vendor. But, this is an earnest reminder that there are solutions out there that are specifically dedicated to addressing this very challenge.
Don't use a spreadsheet.
Don't use a spreadsheet.
All right.
When I think of a specific example with supplier engagement, because that's so much of where we focus, if you do this manually, it's painful. It's onerous. Your suppliers don't want to have to answer 500 different surveys from their 500 different customers about who's asking this question. Leverage technology that can scale and access and scrape all of the information that's already available. Really let technology help you help yourself.
Cool. All right. And what do you find that people are doing? I guess, in some ways, using a spreadsheet is something you don't recommend anymore. But what is there a common mistake or the way they approach thinking about these things that you say, hey, listen, that's not going to work out so well, and here's a better way to think of something?
Yeah. My stop for this is stop thinking about sustainability as a cost center, right? And stop focusing on just the capital expenditure and start considering the payback period, the operational savings, because sustainability is just that. It's sustainable, and that includes financially sustainable. So as an example, think about energy market volatility in your retail stores and how you might want to insulate against price fluctuations of electricity through on-site generation or fixed PPAs. These strategies are all about providing financial sustainability to these very real and very expensive climate-related risks. So stop looking at only one half of the picture and start thinking holistically.
All right. If folks want to learn more, maybe get in touch. Are you a LinkedIn person? Where can they go to learn more about you and the business and the topic in general?
Sure. Well, you can always find me on LinkedIn, but I think your best bet is probably to visit our website, sustain.life. And if you're interested, or if you want to see our tool, book a demo with our team.
Fantastic. Well, Alyssa, thanks so much for joining me on the mic. I mean, it's a big subject to get your arms around. I think you guys do a great work of trying to explain it at all levels. And we really enjoyed meeting you. And I wish you continued success, you and your organization. And once again, thanks for joining me on the pod.
Thanks, Michael. My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure to check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis and the Global eCommerce Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, Senior Retail Advisor, keynote speaker, and Rethink Retail 2023 Global Top Retail Influencer. If you want more information, content, or to chat,
follow me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.